A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year.
Dickens refers to food and drink over 5,000 times.
Dickens looked around him, I think, and looked at the extreme contrasts he could see in Victorian London at the time.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more.
None of the others have the fire of A Christmas Carol, and I think it's because A Christmas Carol was written with such an intention. It was written to change the world.
I think one of the things you've got to remember at this point is he's very conscious of who his audience are.
I think there's probably the sense that Turkey was a sort of goose on steroids. You know, it was the next best thing up.
I think the interesting thing about Dickens was he is a full-on performer.
Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
The election's before us, and the whole government of the country are at present a great reckless betting shop, where the prophets have pocketed their own predictions after playing fast and loose with their patrons as long as they could, and where, casting their practised eyes over things in general, they are now backing anything and everything for a chance of winning.
I love that quote, wonderfully read by Simon Callow, the museum patron. Welcome back to Inimitable, Season 1. For this series we are looking at A Christmas Carol. This quote is not from A Christmas Carol, but from an article written by Dickens called Betting Shops, and he's very critical of the political system, the government which is backing anything and everything for a chance of winning. It's so wonderfully cynical, and I think timeless. Anyone of any political persuasion at any time can read that and in some respects relate to it. But I'm struck by the fact that this was a story which, although it was full of joy and festive beauty, it was also quite stark. Dickens definitely had a message in this book that he was trying to convey. So I'm asking the question today, how political was A Christmas Carol? How political was Dickens? To begin our journey, I spoke to Dr. Lee Jackson, author of Dirty Old London and academic advisor to the Charles Dickens Museum.
I mean, Dickens's attitude to politics and certainly to politicians, it's much easier to pin down his attitude to politicians. We see that from the Pickwick Papers, where there's this sort of comfortable MP who's just milking the system for all it's worth, to Little Dorrit, where you have famously the Circumlocution Office, as an office of state whose main job is to not get things done. So Dickens, he mocks politics and politicians, but he was himself interested in social reform to a degree. We see him involved in sanitary campaigns. He was a member of the Metropolitan Sanitary Association briefly in the 1850s. His writing is a sort of campaigning tool in a way for political change, right? From workhouses through to the Yorkshire schools, through to disgusting burials in Bleak House. So you can't argue he's not thinking politically, but it's certainly not tied to political parties. It's not tied, I don't think, to particular political debates at his time.
Can we say then that A Christmas Carol is a political book?
It's political, clearly, I think, in the broadest sense. There isn't a party politics here in particular. And, those figures of ignorance and want, obviously, they're meant to encompass the whole of the suffering of the poor, really, in the 19th century. They're also a warning. This could be seen as more political. And Dickens explicitly says, if you allow this to continue, particularly ignorance, then you're at risk. And the risk he means is essentially a political one. The risk of political unrest, the risk of riots, the risk of the poor rising up to overwhelm the rich, and he's thinking of, I think it's safe to say, the French Revolution onwards, He writes so memorably in Barnaby Rudge about the Gordon riots and how much of those riots are the product of, just stupidity as well as sort of malicious actors and so on, and this sheer ferocity of the mob once it's raised. And I think he's alluding to that here. He's saying, if you allow ignorance and brutality and suffering to persist amongst the poor, you will pay a price for it. And that's kind of a political threat, right? It's the broadest sort of political threat. He may also be thinking of, again, communicable disease. If the poor, live in these awful conditions, if they're contracting communicable diseases like cholera and typhoid, well, that will come through to you. You're not immune from that as a middle-class person. And that's kind of a political statement as well. It's saying, this is for your own good to actually help these people. So there's a broad sort of political thought behind it, but I mean, you can't escape the fundamental Dickensian attitude in the book is human sympathy. The idea is that you need to have sympathy with the suffering of others. And the feelings of ignorance and want, I guess, are just bringing in a touch of harshness, sort of realism, and perhaps, a slight threat, just to take the edge off the sort of slightly saccharine feel you get from the Ghost of Christmas Present.
So Dickens was interested in issues, in political issues, and he wasn't afraid of making his opinion known. If there was a single moment which triggered Dickens's outrage, as it were, which pushed him to write A Christmas Carol, it was the publication of a parliamentary report in 1842. To tell us about it, here's Dr Cindy Sughrue, director of the Charles Dickens Museum.
Yeah, so thinking about what really motivated Dickens to write A Christmas Carol, it was years before, in 1834, so it's 9 years before he published A Christmas Carol, the new Poor Law was established, and that created a system of workhouses. Now, these ensured that people were housed and clothed and fed, but they were intentionally cruel and harsh institutions because they did not want people to simply turn up at the workhouse and think they can have an easy life. It was intended to move them out. But Dickens was deeply disturbed by the cruelty he saw in these new workhouses, which separated families. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from their children, and they were very harsh prison-like institutions. So he first shone a spotlight on the cruelty of the workhouse in Oliver Twist. And if you remember, Oliver Twist is born in a workhouse, and he has his childhood there. His mother dies shortly after giving birth to him in the workhouse. So Dickens was, again, putting this under the spotlight, under the microscope. So moving ahead into the 1840s, and in the spring of 1843 specifically, a friend of Dickens who was involved in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Children's Employment sent Dickens the Commission's report. And that report was a result of 3 years of investigation into working conditions in mines and factories across the whole of Great Britain. It was a huge undertaking, thousands of pages of testimony, oral testimony from children, some as young as 5, working in those settings. And the report's findings were utterly shocking to Dickens. And he wrote to a friend, he said he was perfectly stricken down by the evidence of widespread suffering amongst these child workers. So Dickens resolved to take action using what he called a sledgehammer force to raise awareness and effect change. He was originally going to write a political pamphlet, similar to as he did in other contexts, like Sunday Under Three Heads was a pamphlet about religious legislation that was moving through Parliament, and he was deeply opposed to it. So he thought, I'll write a pamphlet, but it wasn't a pamphlet that he eventually ended up writing. He struck upon this idea of writing a Christmas story at a time of year when people sit down and read stories, tell stories, ghost stories specifically, a long tradition of that. And he thought this was the time to strike and to reach a wider, much wider public through writing some Christmas entertainment, but really as a vehicle for delivering that sledgehammer blow.
So it was this report, more than anything, this parliamentary report, which really inspired Dickens to write this Christmas book to effect change. Now, we actually have an extract from this report to be read for you by our museum patron Simon Callow, and while you listen to it, just remember that these testimonies are from real people who lived in Britain in the 1840s. Here's Simon Callow.
Joseph Latham, age 9, Orsworth. No rewards. The butties sometimes use a stick as thick as a hedge stake and hit them over the legs and back and bruise them. They kick them and pull their ears because they do not get their asses on sharp enough. Has known Jonathan Watts, a butty, Peter boy, named Jemmy Robinson, with his fist and stick pull his ears and kick him until Robinson's father was obliged to send him home. When the father complained, he was told the boy could not get the ass on, and no more notice was taken of it. Other boys have been shamefully used by this man. He struck a boy named Slater with his stick. The boy fell, and he then stamped on him until the boy could scarcely stand. He never told his masters. He said he should not, for he should only be served worse. Slater is near 15. Robinson is nearly as old.
He was very critical of the fact that Parliament at the time was largely ruled by aristocrats who were fairly aloof, who were using what the political system might offer to feather their own nest for their own financial gain. Maybe it's not too different to where we are today. So he didn't align himself to a particular political party. In fact, he referred to the Tories as people whom politically I despise and abhor. And he was very much, as we would consider today, left of centre. He was a reformist, as it was known then. And he did, for the most part, criticise through his writing, both his journalism and his fiction, political structures, again, where he could see abuse of power. He satirised politicians. I don't think there's anything in his writing that portrays a favourable view of a politician or a political structure. There's a great satirical element of Pickwick Papers, his first novel, where the Pickwickians go off to a place called Eatanswill and witness an election, so local election, and he just sends up these two opposing candidates, but also making quite a strong commentary on the hypocritical nature of politicians and politics. So I love the fact that he's sending them up. But in real life, he did have time and respect for a couple of eminent politicians. Lord John Russell, he was a reformist, and Dickens really backed the fact that Russell was trying to make a difference to working people's lives. And similarly, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury, and people will know Shaftesbury Avenue, and they might know Russell Square.
Yeah.
So these great men who were trying to make a difference, and these were reformists. So Dickens got to know some politicians and added popular fuel to their campaigns through his own writing. I know that Karl Marx was an admirer of Dickens' work, as a number of the activists of the day were, because they felt that Dickens really understood and shared the conditions of working people, who were the people they were trying to help. But Dickens was very uncomfortable with revolutionary ideas, because of course, the French Revolution was not in the far distant past when Dickens was alive. And of course he portrays this in A Tale of Two Cities, one of only 2 historical novels that he wrote. And he found it very frightening that there they were in the mid-19th century, and the Chartist movement and radical interpretations of life, and I suppose political movements that felt very dangerous. So Dickens, in writing A Tale of Two Cities, was setting it in the French Revolution, but was really commenting on the revolutionary drive and tendencies that he could see bubbling up around him as a direct result of the institutions of government and law and church, religion, not using their money and their power to improve the condition of working people. So he could see the very dangerous territory that was being inhabited, and he genuinely feared that there could be revolution in London, in Britain, in the way that the world had seen in France just across the water not many years before.
I think this context is really fascinating, the understanding that Dickens was writing not that long after the French Revolution. In fact, A Christmas Carol was published in 1843. The Last King of France was executed in 1793, so there was a distance of only 50 years between the fall of the French monarchy and the publication of A Christmas Carol. So that's really the same as the 1970s to today. That's how close this revolutionary moment was to Dickens when he was writing A Christmas Carol. And I guess that's important. We often look back at the Victorian era and think of it as a time of stability and progress. But there were all these tensions bubbling up in society. There were new political philosophies emerging. Karl Marx was, of course, very active in the 1840s. So the old status quo was being fundamentally questioned. And of course, let's not forget, there were, I think, 7 assassination attempts against Queen Victoria herself. So the period was a lot more turbulent than we like to perhaps remember. And Dickens was reacting to all of this throughout his life and throughout his fiction. But we are, of course, talking about A Christmas Carol specifically. And so I wanted to know a bit more about what were the political aims of this novella, if indeed he had any, and what was its lasting political impact. To answer these questions, I spoke to Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, author of Dickens and Christmas, patron of the Charles Dickens Museum, and 3 times great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens. Did Dickens have, do you think, a direct political aim? I mean, you mentioned the mines. Was he hoping that there would be new laws passed against child poverty, or...?
Oh yes, Dickens always had an aim, and he was quite a thorn in the side of politicians. I read once that many politicians didn't like him, but he was much more popular than he was, so they had to keep quiet about it. He was asked to become a politician, and he very wisely said no. He was, apart from anything else, he was a businessman, and he knew full well that if he joined one political party, people who supported the other political party would stop reading his books. But he also knew that the most important thing he could do to bring about change would be to write about it, because that was his gift. He could write about an issue, for example, in Nicholas Nickleby, think of the Yorkshire schools, and it changed things. He wrote very proudly that within a couple of years of Nicholas Nickleby being published, all of those Yorkshire schools, which were places that, horrible, cruel places that unwanted children were sent to, and they'd all been closed down from the power of his novel. Now, he had written about this as a journalist, but the novel was what really got people going. Dickens understood, as so many filmmakers and TV writers realise, that if you put something into fiction, you can get your message across. And he did effect change. There were many laws that came into being prompted by Dickens's writing. I mean, he's been credited with helping to bring about changes in labour laws, particularly child labour laws, but labour laws in general. He's credited, although it happened after his death, but he began the process with the international copyright law, beginning that process and pushing for that. He's also credited with changes in things like bringing about the Education Act. So much of Dickens's writing was used by legislators and campaigners to say, this is what Mr. Dickens said, this is true, we need to change it. So his writing really did change the world. I don't think that's over-egging it. I think that is a statement that actually is factual. Dickens wrote things and people listened.
And it's fascinating. I think was it George Bernard Shaw who said Dickens was, Great Expectations was more seditious than Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto.
Yes.
It does not say it all. You know?
It really does say it all. And if you read Dickens, that's absolutely what you can get out of it. That, people want, the Magwiches of this world to get a better deal. He's been transported for such a ridiculously petty crime. The law, as Dickens felt when he worked as a young man, as a teenager, as a solicitor's clerk, the law was weighted entirely in favour of the rich. People often quote him and say the law is an ass, which is a slight misquoting of Dickens anyway. But what he was saying was, we need to change this. We need the law to be a good instrument, and something that is applicable to everybody, not just those who've got money to manipulate it, but those who need it most. And many people will say today that's still the case, that we've had a huge step forward, and there have been many strides forward in legal aid, for example. But a lot of those have recently been eroded, and actually the law still does benefit those who can pay most for it. There's still campaigning work that needs to be done on all the things that Dickens campaigned for. Many have come a long way, but they're never entirely fixed.
In a way, it's almost tragic that the same themes that drove Dickens to write are still with us. And I think that's what's almost sad. You know, it's wonderful in some respects that it stayed relevant, but it's also sad that it stayed relevant, because these things, child poverty, suffering, ignorance, really, where people don't necessarily want to pay attention to suffering around them, that is still such a fundamental part of humanity. And
it makes me absolutely livid.
It does.
I was reading, actually just this morning, the statistics on child poverty in this country and malnutrition, the numbers of people who have been recently admitted to hospital with malnutrition. They're the ones who've been admitted to hospital, not the ones who haven't reached that stage yet. It is absolutely appalling that in one of the richest countries in the world, we are permitting this to happen. It's a staggering amount of children who go to school hungry, whose parents aren't being cruel. They physically cannot afford to buy them food for breakfast. Christmas Carol was written in 1843, 180 years ago, and the same stuff is happening. Every single year I look out for it, there will be, and I guarantee whatever country you're listening to this in, a journalist somewhere will write an article saying, Dickens wrote about this in 1843, and we're still living through the same things.
And I think that's the power, isn't it, of A Christmas Carol, is that the impact Dickens wanted it to have on his Victorian audience, it's still having. I remember when I read it, I'd read it when I was younger and I'd watched lots of adaptations, but I hadn't read it for some years, and then I read it again after I started working here. And after finished reading it, you go out and walk down the street and you're catching a train, and suddenly you notice the homeless person sitting next to you, or you notice the person who's clearly desperate. You notice the people around you so much more, and you notice the need. And I think that's the good thing to come of it, I suppose, is that there's still hope, isn't there? If Dickens can change your mind today, and people are still reading his books, perhaps something can come of it still.
I think that's true, and I think the whole idea of the pen being mightier than the sword, absolutely true. I mean, the sword might be a short-term solution, but the pen goes on.
One of the great frustrations felt by, I think, anyone who has tried to work on poverty or social injustice is that the job is never really done. No matter how far humanity advances, these problems always seem to be present. And you can look back at any period in history and you'll always find people in poverty, people who are persecuted, people who face injustice. It's almost a part of humanity, a very heartbreaking and troubling part of humanity. A Christmas Carol was not a book which would resolve all of these issues. To the Victorians, they tried things like the workhouse as a means of bringing people out of extreme poverty. Today, we have a much, I think, kinder system, the welfare state, the NHS, various institutions which again aim to alleviate that sense of people being left behind, people who are suffering unnecessarily. And yet, of course, poverty is still part of our society. Suffering is still part of our society. We haven't resolved these issues even today. Though I think it's fair to say we've come a long way since Charles Dickens' time. But I think therein lies the real power of A Christmas Carol, and I guess the ultimate aim that Charles Dickens had when he wrote this novella. He knew, undoubtedly, that this book was not going to solve all the issues of the day. But what it could do, and what it still does do, is it forces us all to pay attention. By following the journey of Scrooge on his supernatural trip through his life, we are forced to confront ourselves. We are forced to confront our own past and sense of nostalgia. We are forced to confront our own present, to look at our failings. And we are forced to think ahead at our own future and what sort of legacy we want to leave behind. In so doing, Dickens created something that was powerful, because it still holds the power to change hearts and to change minds today. No matter the age, no matter the society, no matter the political colours of the government, A Christmas Carol has the power to open our eyes, to open our hearts, and to encourage us to resolve to build a better tomorrow. In that, it is perhaps one of the most powerful and important books which has ever been written. In the next episode, the final instalment of Inimitable, we're looking at how to have a good party like Charles Dickens.
Even here in Doughty Street, as a very young couple, they were hosting gatherings, celebrations, dinners, soirees.
I think there's probably the sense that Turkey was a sort of goose on steroids. You know, it was the next best thing up.
He's talking about how he came back dead drunk at 1 a.m. and had to be put to bed by his missus.
Inimitable is produced and presented by me, Jordan Evans-Hill. Our contributors are Dr Cindy Sughrue, Dr Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, as well as Dr Lee Jackson, Penn Vogler, Lucinda Hawksley, Miriam Margolyes and Simon Callow. Thanks for listening.